A Time to Torture, Jon Burge and the Midnight Crew.
Did you use some kind of electrical device that generated electricity on Anthony Holmes to give him shocks when you were interrogating him?
I'll adapt my initial response as the answer to that question.
You taking the fifth on that?
Yes.
And did you also repeatedly participate in putting a plastic bag or a typewriter cover over his head when you were interrogating him in May of 1973?
I'll adapt my initial response as the answer to that question.
You taking the fifth?
Yes.
And did you use a black box, a similar or the same electrical device that you had used in previous occasions at Area 2 on Andrew Wilson in order to interrogate him and to get a statement from him?
I'll adapt my initial response as the answer.
And you take the fifth on that?
Yes.
Focusing on torture as a neuroscientific problem changes your perspective entirely about what the use of torture is about. What we can say with certainty is that imposing extreme stressors on the brain, things like sleep deprivation, starvation, freezing, actually militates against the gathering of reliable and veridical information. And what we know in humans is that when you impose extreme stressors on humans, such as sleep deprivation, if you starve a person, if you bring them to the point of near death through repeated suffocation, that we drive activity in the brain away from brain areas that are concerned with memory, concerned with cognition, toward brain areas that are concerned with immediate survival. My interest in this area came actually from a reading of memos that have now become infamous, the so-called torture memos, where lawyers in the then George Bush government articulated reasons why, on behalf of the CIA, it would be appropriate to use what were euphemistically referred to as enhanced interrogation techniques, a term actually given to us originally by the Gestapo. If you want to induce post-traumatic stress disorder in somebody, it's a very, very good way of doing this is to shackle them, to starve them, to near drown them, and to do so repeatedly. If you want to get good information from people, this is not the way to proceed. Good interrogators, first of all, uniformly repudiate torture as a method of proceeding. What we need is to take interrogation out of the coercive realm, and we have to think of it as being much more akin to a psychological or a psychiatric interview, where we're dealing with people who are in difficult circumstances, but nonetheless, they must be treated in an ethical and humane fashion.
The case of Jon Burge and the Chicago Police Department is a tragic reminder of the institutionalized racism and brutality that exists within our law enforcement agencies. Federal prosecutors said that between 1972 and 1991, Commander Jon Burge led a gang of police officers known as the Midnight Crew that tortured and assaulted men and women in order to extract false confessions. Jon Burge became a Chicago police officer in 1970. Burge was promoted to detective 2 years later. Allegations of torture appeared early in his career. On May 29, 1973, officers kicked open the door to Anthony Holmes' residence, held a shotgun to his head, and threatened to kill him. Anthony Holmes was arrested and taken to Area 2 of the police station, where he was tortured. Officers arrested Holmes on suspicion of murder and demanded that he name his accomplice. According to police, Anthony Holmes planned Joseph Murphy's murder in 1972 because Murphy wanted to testify against Holmes' brother Luther Colburn. After Holmes refused to confess, the officers decided to keep him confined in an interrogation room and went to locate Detective Jon Burge. Shortly after, Burge arrived in the room, carrying a brown paper bag that concealed a black box. The box was equipped with a hand-operated crank at one end and 2 cables with alligator clamps at the other. Burge then grabbed the clamps and said, "N-word, you're going to tell me what I want to know." He tightened the clamps and drew a plastic bag over Holmes' head, advising him not to bite through it when the pain kicked in. Holmes was then electrocuted and he bit through the plastic bag, a reflex reaction caused by the pain. Then everything went black, and when he woke up, Burge was putting a fresh plastic bag over his head. The terrible panic of suffocation compounded the pain of the electric shocks. A rumor in the department had it that Burge had first perfected these techniques on North Vietnamese prisoners of war. Anthony Holmes eventually broke down and confessed to a murder he didn't commit. During the decades he spent in prison, his wife divorced him and 8 members of his family died.
When they first took me to Burnside, they put handcuffs, I learned handcuff from the back. They put handcuffs on my leg. Burge handcuffed me. He was going to torture me, slap me in the face and call me niggas and all this. He's going to put the plastic bag over my head.
And Burge and Dignan, same guys, put bags over their heads, punched them while they had no air supply, caused them to lose their breath, to think they were dying.
But when they got to torture me, I told about, man, if you want me to say God, if God killed me, I was killing God, I did that too. Because that's how bad it was.
Decades later, Anthony Holmes offered a violent victim impact statement about that night during one of the many attempts to bring Burge to justice. I still have nightmares, not as bad as they were, but I still have them. I wake up in a cold sweat. I still fear that I am going to go back to jail for this again. I see myself falling in a deep hole and there's no one to help me. That is what it feels like. I felt hopeless and helpless when it happened, and when I dream I feel like I am in that room again, screaming for help and no one comes to help me. I keep trying to turn the dream around, but it keeps being the same. I can never expect when I will have the dream. I just lay down at night, and then I wake up and the bed is soaked. Burge and the other detectives who were involved, Michael Hoke and William Wagner, were issued commendations from the police department for their questioning in the Anthony Holmes case. Anthony Holmes was imprisoned for over 30 years before being released on parole in 2004.
I never thought that the police were part of the process of justice. I've always thought the police would be part of the process of injustice and messing with it and of repressing it. And I don't know any black man, Puerto Rican man, any man of color raised in the city who wouldn't feel the same way. I don't know any who haven't been stopped one time or another, harassed. And then in that minute, you're suddenly this guy has the power of life and death over you.
Gregory Banks was only 20 years old when he was arrested at a game room located on the south side of Chicago. On October 28, 1983, Banks had gotten into a fight with Leon Barkin and Jeltro Givens during a drug deal. During the fight, Gregory Banks allegedly pulled out a gun and shot Leon Barkin. Evidence suggested that Leon was shot by accident while him and Banks fought. Barkin would die from his injuries and Jeltro Givens would get away. Banks was arrested and taken to Area 2 and tortured for 31 hours. Gregory would later testify that Area 2 detectives beat him with a flashlight and kicked him in the stomach. Right before they put the plastic bag over his head, one detective said, "We have something for N-words." Banks claims he was suffocated 2 times before he agreed to confess to being involved in the murder of Leon Barkin. Gregory Banks stated that he was tortured for a second time right before his trial by Sergeant Jon Burge, Detective Peter Dignan, and Charles Grenhard. Banks testified that he was kicked and hit all over his back and legs. While they were beating him, they yelled, "We know you did it. We want you to tell us why you did it." Judge Robert Składowski of the Cook County Circuit Court refused to examine evidence of torture or Banks' likely coerced confession as evidence that could be used to exonerate him during his original trial. On September 9, 1985, Banks was convicted and sentenced to 50 years in prison by Judge Składowski for first-degree murder and armed robbery. Dr. Walter Romine, who saw Banks just days after he was admitted to Cook County Jail, testified at trial that Banks said he received injuries at the hands of the Chicago Police Department, and he said he was taken from his detention cell sometime later in the night and that a bag was placed over his head. Banks' injuries, Romine explained, were consistent with the story that he told me, of being beaten to extract a confession. In an opinion released 6 years later, appellate judge Jon Burge chastised the trial judge. In a landmark decision that resulted in Banks' conviction being overturned, Burge admonished judges who had failed to act on charges of torture.
Trial judges must be most circumspect when it appears that a right, guaranteed to every citizen by our Constitution, may have been violated by police brutality or racial discrimination, because those affected are invariably the poorest, weakest, and least educated, who are not sophisticated enough or do not have the resources to see and ensure that they are not denied the protections afforded by the rights and guarantees of our Constitution.
The appellate judges also stated that the evidence offered during his first trial should have been taken more seriously. Banks claimed that Barkin's death was an accident caused by a scuffle over his gun. In its December 1989 verdict, the appeal court concurred, citing forensic evidence showing the bullets struck the ground. Surely, one does not point and fire a gun at the ground if one intends to kill someone, the court ruled. Aside from the coerced confession, prosecutors had little else to tie Banks to the crime. On October 31, 1990, the city dropped the case against Gregory Banks.
I would never forget them. They took my life from me. They took my family from me. They took my kids from me. They took everything I had for 31 years. And I can never forget that.
3 detectives entered into Stanley Rice's home while he was sleeping on September 9, 1982. The officers pointed their weapons at Stanley's face and proceeded to wake up the other 3 people in the house. One officer remained in the room with Stanley, his sister, and his brother, while the other 2 officers searched the house. The investigators then notified Rice that they were investigating a rape and arrested him. Stanley alleged that after he was arrested, an unknown sergeant and a female officer named Frankie Peters arrived at his residence and took him to Area 2. Rice was then placed alone in a second-floor interview room and handcuffed to a ring attached to the wall. Rice was interrogated about the rape by Detective Dignan and Detective Diaguardi. One of the detectives said to Stanley, "You know what the F happened." In the presence of Sergeant Byrne, Detective Dignan uncuffed Rice and demanded him to stand up, adding, "I'm going to take him downstairs and show him some police brutality." Sergeant Byrne and Detective Dignan, according to Stanley, walked him downstairs and took him into a room that resembled a holding cell with bars on the windows. Rice was questioned further by Byrne and Dignan, and when they didn't get the desired confession, Sergeant Byrne struck Stanley on the forehead with a flashlight. Detective Dignan then struck Rice on the legs, arms, and back with an item that looked like a blackjack. Stanley was then led upstairs and shackled to the ring on the wall for a second time. Rice was then left in the room for around 30 to 45 minutes while detectives spoke with coerced Rodney Benson. Byrne and Dignan returned to Stanley Rice's room and informed him that he had been lying, after which they brought him back to Area 2's basement. Sergeant Byrne directed Rice to face a set of iron bars, and they proceeded to beat him in the groin with the blackjack multiple times. Stanley added that because he was handcuffed, all he could do was yell. Stanley Rice was then led back to the second floor and questioned about the rape by State Attorney McCurry in front of Byrne, Dignan, and Diaguardi. Rice was moved to another interview room and left there. Stanley would later describe bruising on his left arm, forehead, and legs. He also stated that he suffered groin pain for a week. Rice was treated at Cermak Health Services and told Dr. Stanley Harper about his injuries. Stanley Rice stated that he did not report the torture to State Attorney McCurry because he was worried it would happen again. Karen Byron, the victim, testified that she was walking to a liquor store when several African American men approached her and offered her a ride, which she accepted. The men dragged her to a two-story home where she was beaten, severely burned by hot metal objects placed against her skin, and raped on multiple occasions. When the men finally let her go, she stumbled into a gas station where the employee contacted the police. She was hospitalized with burns that covered more than 80% of her body. Karen Byron did not identify Stanley Rice, but she did identify the other three men, Michael Fowler, Rodney Benson, and Lee Holmes. All three men would plead guilty in accordance with their plea bargains. Fowler received a 4-year prison sentence, but Benson and Holmes received only 30 months probation. Rice was charged as a result of his confession. Rice filed a motion to suppress the confession prior to his 1983 trial, claiming that Dignan and Byrne tortured him. Detective Dignan and Detective Byrne rejected the accusation, and Rice's motion to suppress his confession was denied by Judge Thomas Fitzgerald. In addition to introducing Rice's supposed confession, prosecutors presented 2 eyewitnesses, Bobby Joe Williams and Kenneth Lewis, who testified that they saw Rice rape Karen Byron and burn her with a hot spoon during the trial. Despite the lack of physical evidence linking him to the crime and the victim's failure to identify him, the jury quickly convicted Rice of rape and deviant sexual assault. Judge Fitzgerald sentenced Rice to 60 years in prison for rape and 40 years in prison for deviant sexual assault, for a total of 100 years. On August 15, 1985, the Illinois Appellate Court upheld the conviction but ordered the sentences to be served concurrently rather than consecutively, effectively reducing the term to 60 years. The Circuit Court refused Rice's handwritten petition for post-conviction relief. Illinois Public Defender Heidi Lambrose was assigned to represent him on appeal. When the appeal was denied, Stanley lost his right to a public defender. Lambrose, on the other hand, was so certain of his innocence that she continued to work on the case on her own time. Special Prosecutor Edward Egan probed into allegations of police torture where he identified several detectives involved in such violations including Byrne and Dignan. Attorney Heidi Lambrose submitted a request for post-conviction relief in Stanley's case citing findings by Egan in his report, but the initial application was denied by the Circuit Court. Thanks to intervention from the Illinois Appellate Court, her motion was approved. Bobby Williams changed his testimony in court while the appeal was pending and gave an affidavit to students working for the Chicago Innocence Project. In the affidavit, Williams claimed Dignan and Byrne tortured him and led him to falsely accuse Rice. Bobby Williams' affidavit added that an attorney at the Cook County Criminal Courts building showed him pictures of Karen Byron's injuries before Rice's trial and threatened to charge him if he did not testify against Stanley. Bobby had no idea who the attorney was, but the lead prosecutor in the case, Bertina Lampkin, who would later become an Illinois Appellate Court judge, matched his description. In a unanimous opinion on February 2, 2012, the Supreme Court upheld the Appellate Court's order requesting a hearing on Rice's allegations of torture. The hearing led to Rice being cleared and released.
That when I left, she wasn't but a year old. I missed all of her life. I know she missed mine.